It started as an occasional squeak, barely noticeable over the sound of the city bustling far below. Living on the 12th floor, I assumed it was just wind pressing against the glass or pigeons that sometimes perch near my windows. But soon, the noise became a nightly event. It was one of those evenings when everything felt oddly out of place. My small apartment was bathed in the glow of the television, which cast distorted shadows onto the walls. The usual comfort of home seemed thin, a flimsy barrier between me and the darkness outside. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I heard it again, long, scraping sounds along the glass, followed by the distinct swish of something moving along the panes. My stomach twisted. This wasn't the wind. This sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost human. I stood up slowly, heart thudding in my chest, and approached the living room window. The curtains billowed slightly, even though the windows were shut tight. With each cautious step, my mind raced through a list of rational explanations, but nothing stuck. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain and pulled it back. Outside, suspended in the night air by thick ropes, was a figure dressed in a dark jumpsuit, a tool belt hanging heavily from his waist. He looked like any professional window cleaner, except there wasn't supposed to be any cleaning service scheduled this late. My mouth went dry as I took in the details. The figure's rubber gloves, the squeegee methodically dragging across the glass. But what made my blood run cold was the full-face mask he wore. One that was completely blank, devoid of features, reflecting only the pale glow of my apartment. He worked with eerie precision, scrubbing the window as if it were a perfectly normal job. But then he paused. The mask turned toward me, and although there were no eyes, I could feel his stare. My breath caught in my throat, and every instinct told me to back away. But I couldn't move. He lifted one gloved hand and placed it flat against the glass, fingers splayed, pressing hard enough that I could see the creases in the rubber. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, to call for help, to do something. The figure tilted his head, and then, without warning, he reached for a small, black device strapped to his belt. He held it up, and a red light blinked once, twice, before a high-pitched screech erupted from it, vibrating the windows. The noise was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard multiplied 1,000 times over. I clamped my hands over my ears, tears pricking my eyes from the pressure. When the sound stopped, I dared to look again. The window was smeared with something dark, a substance that trailed from the spot where his hand had pressed. He leaned closer, his mask nearly touching the glass, and a chilling realization struck me. The substance was red, blood red. I scrambled to my phone, fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock it. But the screen was unresponsive, static flickering across it. I glanced back at the window, and he was gone. Only the swinging ropes remained, dangling into the void below. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound, any hint of movement. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, with trembling limbs, I approached the window again, peering into the darkness. The streets below carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honking, people moving about their lives. I almost convinced myself it was a bizarre hallucination until I noticed the smear on the glass. The handprint was still there, stark and vivid. That night, I didn't sleep. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. The next morning, I called building management, who assured me that no cleaning service had been scheduled. They checked the security footage, but the cameras facing my side of the building had mysteriously malfunctioned. I tried to rationalize it, tried to convince myself it was a prank or some kind of terrible coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever that man was, he'd been watching, working carefully to erode the thin sense of safety I thought my high-rise walls provided. And as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be back, hanging in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to return. Working in airport lost and found seemed dull at first. Just another job shuffling unclaimed suitcases and tired travelers' items. The monotony was broken only by the occasional absurdity, someone forgetting a violin or even a prosthetic leg. But that day, my routine was shattered in a way I'd never imagined. A black, battered suitcase came in on one of the airport's bustling afternoons, wheeled in by a security guard who looked uneasy. He dropped it off with barely a word, only a muttered mention of it being abandoned near Gate 14. I signed it into the log, noting its weight, its nondescript appearance, and the way it seemed oddly cold to the touch. Then I set about my usual inspection to determine if it held anything dangerous. As I unzipped the case, a waft of stale air escaped, and I hesitated. A part of me wanted to stop, to shove the suitcase into a corner and forget about it. But protocol demanded I continue. Inside, neatly stacked, were manila envelopes, each filled with photographs. They were organized too well, as if someone had painstakingly planned it. I picked up the first envelope and slid out a handful of glossy prints. The pictures were of people in mundane situations. A man sipping coffee at a cafe, a woman crossing a street, a teenage boy waiting for a bus. Each photo felt too personal, like an intrusion into lives that had never given permission to be observed. As I leafed through them, a chill worked its way up my spine. Every subject looked unaware, caught in some private moment, oblivious to the camera that had captured them. I reached the bottom of the first envelope, my fingers trembling slightly. The last photo was unmistakably recent, judging by the clothes and surroundings. A young woman stood at an airport terminal, looking tired. My blood ran cold when I realized it was me. The shot was from behind, taken just hours ago while I was on a break. I remembered exactly when I'd stood in that spot, tapping at my phone, blissfully ignorant. My breath quickened as I glanced around the office, half expecting someone to be watching. The walls felt like they were closing in, each shadow threatening to move. I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I had imagined that the photo was recent. But I hadn't. The timestamp printed at the bottom was undeniable. I dug deeper into the suitcase, pulling out more envelopes. Each contained pictures from the same airport, and as I frantically examined them, I saw familiar faces. Co-workers, passengers I recognized from that day. The realization struck hard. Whoever had left this suitcase had been here, inside the airport, taking these photos with methodical precision. My hands were clammy, the air suddenly thick. I reached for my phone to call security, but before I could dial, a buzzing erupted from the suitcase. Somewhere beneath the layers of envelopes, a phone was ringing. The sound was harsh, echoing in the small room like a threat. I carefully moved the envelopes aside and found a burner phone, its screen flashing. The name displayed simply read, Anonymous. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to walk out and never look back. But curiosity or foolishness took over, and I answered. Silence greeted me on the other end, so heavy it was almost palpable. My mouth went dry. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice whispered through the line. It was distorted, unnatural, like someone speaking through layers of static. Do you like the photos? The voice asked, each word drawn out, taunting. I dropped the phone in shock, and it clattered to the floor. The call disconnected on its own, leaving me in oppressive silence. My mind spun, my legs unsteady as I stumbled backward. The suitcase loomed like a dark presence, the photos spilling out of it like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet comprehended. I ran out of the room, breathless, and found the nearest security guard. When we returned, the suitcase was gone, along with the photos. Only the faint impression on the carpet where it had rested remained. An investigation was launched, but nothing ever came of it. Security footage mysteriously glitched, and no trace of the case or its contents was ever found. I kept working at the airport, though my nerves were shot, and every time I stood near Gate 14, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The sense of being watched never quite left me. It sounded like a perfect idea for a Saturday, an adrenaline-pumping escape room experience with friends. We'd all heard about the new place in town, promising a challenge unlike any other. The most intense yet, their flyers boasted, and we were ready to put our problem-solving skills to the test. We were ushered into a dimly lit room that reeked of stale air and old paint. The game master, a man with tired eyes and a practiced smile, explained the rules. No phones, no external help, and a strict 60-minute time limit. The door clicked shut behind us, and we were sealed in. The first puzzles were simple enough. Classic riddles, a few hidden keys, and some math problems scratched onto a chalkboard. We laughed, joked about our cluelessness, and felt the thrill of the game. But the fun drained away quickly when one of the locks we needed to open refused to budge. No matter how many times we tried the combination, we'd figured out. The numbers were right, but the lock stayed firm. The room felt warmer, and I noticed beads of sweat forming on one of my friend's temples. Maybe it's just part of the game, I thought, but I couldn't shake the unease. We banged on the door, calling for the game master. No answer. A tightness gripped my chest, and the room felt smaller. We tried the emergency call button, but there was only static. That's when it hit me. We had no way to communicate with anyone outside. Minutes ticked by, each second pressing down heavier than the last. One of my friends, a usually calm and collected guy named Derek, decided to test the strength of the door. He threw his shoulder into it, and a sickening thud echoed through the small room. No give. The door didn't even rattle. The lights flickered, plunging us in a momentary darkness before sputtering back on. The glow now felt harsh, almost surgical, and every shadow stretched longer than it should have. As we debated what to do, a metallic click came from above. We looked up to see a camera lens, previously inactive, whirring to life and focusing on us. My mouth went dry. Was someone watching us? Time blurred and panic set in. One of the puzzles required us to slide our hands into a narrow opening to feel for clues. My friend Lisa tried, only to yank her hand back with a yelp, blood trickling from a small gash on her knuckles. There were sharp metal shards embedded in the slot, hidden from view. This wasn't just a game anymore. With growing dread, I began searching the room for any overlooked detail that could hint at an escape. But all I found were more unsettling elements. Rusty screws barely holding up a creaking shelf, a loose brick with what looked like old, dried smears of something dark underneath. Our laughter from earlier now felt distant, absurd in the suffocating silence. We all turned our eyes to the exit, where the countdown clock was still running, digits slipping away mercilessly. With only 10 minutes left, we heard footsteps. Relief flooded me, thinking it was the game master coming to our rescue. But the footsteps weren't hurried, nor were they coming from the outside. They were echoing from a hidden speaker, just to mess with us. The clock reached 0, and a loud buzzer went off. The lights shut off completely, and the room was consumed by pitch blackness. My breath caught as something cold brushed my ankle, something deliberate, calculated. Then, with a mechanical hum, a thin strip of red emergency lighting illuminated the floor, revealing nothing but our own panicked shadows. We pounded on the walls, screamed for help, and then silence. The exits were still sealed, and there was no sign of the game master or any staff. After what felt like an eternity, a panel slid open in one wall, and a gust of cold air swept in. We ran for it, stumbling out into the harsh glare of fluorescent hallway lights. But no one was there to greet us. No staff, no other groups. The lobby we had entered through was eerily deserted. The only sign of life was a note pinned to the reception desk. Congratulations on your escape. Now you know the real meaning of fear. We bolted out of that building, hearts racing, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We reported the incident to the police, but by the time they arrived, the place was empty. No sign of any escape room business ever having operated there. It was as if the entire thing had been a nightmare, one we couldn't wake from. Hey. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. The rental cabin was tucked deep in the woods, a picturesque hideaway with a wraparound porch and a small fireplace inside. We'd booked it to escape from the chaos of daily life. No emails, no traffic, just the quiet hum of nature. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky already darkening with thick clouds. I noticed how dense the forest was, the trees pressing close to the cabin like silent sentinels. It felt a little too quiet, but I dismissed it, City living had made me forget how serene true wilderness could be. As we unpacked and settled in, I noticed the etchings. They were carved into the wooden beams, faint but deliberate. Warnings and messages, things like they watch from the woods and never go outside at night. I ran my fingers over the jagged letters, wondering if it was some prank left by previous renters. My partner laughed it off, and I tried to shake the unease creeping into my bones. Night fell fast. The fireplace crackled, casting warm, dancing light across the walls, but the cabin's coziness felt thin, as though it barely kept the dark outside at bay. I kept glancing out the windows, the forest black and impenetrable beyond the glass. My phone had a single bar of reception, but I didn't think much of it. Being disconnected was the whole point of coming here. Then the footsteps started. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of movement among the leaves. My ears strained, heart thudding in time with the crackling fire. Maybe it was an animal. That's what I told myself until I heard the unmistakable crunch of heavy boots circling the cabin. Each step deliberate, slow. The air thickened with dread, and I clenched my hands together to stop them from trembling. I turned off the fireplace lights, hoping the darkness would hide us. The cabin sank into silence, save for my own ragged breathing. We huddled together on the floor, waiting. The footsteps stopped, but that wasn't a comfort. It only made the silence heavier, like a coiled spring about to snap. I crawled toward a window, barely daring to peek through the curtain. My blood ran cold. A shape stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible, a dark outline against the inky woods. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it was watching. My gut twisted with the certainty that it wasn't here by accident. Our phones were useless now. Even the single bar of service had vanished. I tried turning mine on and off, but the screen only flickered with static before dying. The cabin felt like a trap, a fragile bubble ready to burst. Then the door rattled, a gentle, testing pressure, as if someone were running their fingers over the wood. My partner's eyes widened, and I gestured for silence. My throat felt like it was full of sand. We backed away, our limbs stiff and clumsy, and grabbed whatever we could use as a weapon. An iron poker from the fireplace, a heavy candlestick. The door rattled again, harder this time. The sound was like a nightmare coming to life. We held our breath, muscles tensed, waiting for the moment it would burst open. But instead, the noise stopped. A moment of false relief washed over me until I realized something was different. The windows. Each window around the cabin, one after the other, was being tapped on, as if surrounded by an entire circle of unseen visitors. Tap, 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 in a rhythm that felt mocking, taunting. Whoever, or whatever, they wanted us to know we were trapped. Panic set in. The messages carved into the beams made horrifying sense now. Never go outside at night. But staying inside felt no safer. My mind raced for an escape plan, but the cabin was small. Every possible exit watched. The tapping finally ceased, leaving a suffocating quiet. And then I heard a whisper, low and distorted, slipping through the cracks in the walls. "We see you." My heart lurched. There was no mistaking it. Someone or multiple someones were right outside, and they knew exactly where we were. We didn't sleep that night, clutching our makeshift weapons until our fingers went numb, waiting for dawn to break. When the first gray light of morning bled through the trees, we gathered our things and bolted for the car, not daring to look back. The silence behind us felt almost disappointed. We never reported it. What could we say? We left that cabin and its warnings behind, but the unease never left me. Even now, I still think about the etchings, wondering if they were carved by someone who had been lucky enough to make it out. The morning after a night out with friends, I woke up with that familiar, groggy ache behind my eyes and the heavy realization that my phone was missing. I chalked it up to one too many drinks and probably losing it at the bar. Frustrating, sure, but replaceable. At least that's what I thought until I began getting texts from my own number. The first message was innocuous enough. "Nice outfit today." I read it with bleary confusion, thinking it must have been some kind of spam or a prank from a friend who'd found my phone. I didn't think much of it and made a mental note to cancel my number later. I put on my usual jeans and a black hoodie and trudged out the door, already feeling the weight of an exhausting day. But the next message came only minutes after I left my apartment. Jeans and a hoodie. Predictable. My skin prickled, and I instinctively looked around. People rushed by on their morning commutes, none of them paying attention to me. The street felt busier, louder, and yet somehow emptier. The sensation that someone was watching me settled heavily between my shoulder blades. I stopped at a cafe to calm myself, chalking it up to a weird coincidence. But another message buzzed through, this time far more specific. Don't look so nervous. You'll ruin that coffee. I nearly dropped my cup, my hands trembling. I scanned the cafe, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Faces blurred past, all strangers with no discernible interest in me. My heart pounded, the caffeine forgotten as dread settled in. The texts escalated throughout the day, growing more personal. You shouldn't have taken this route to work. Then, your apartment was unlocked when you left. Panic replaced confusion. I rushed home, fumbling with my keys and finding the door still locked. Yet, the thought of someone having been there, knowing such intimate details, gnawed at me. I called the police, feeling foolish but too unsettled to care. They took a report, but didn't seem overly concerned. Probably just a prank, they said. I wanted to believe that, to push away the fear clawing at my mind, but something about this didn't feel harmless. Whoever had my phone knew too much. Too many things only someone following me closely could know. The last text of the day came as I sat in my dimly lit living room, curtains drawn tight. You looked better unaware. It wasn't a simple taunt. It was a threat wrapped in familiarity. It suggested that someone had been near me, closer than I dared to realize, and relish my discomfort. That evening, I decided to trace my phone's location using my laptop. The GPS pinged it at a public restroom a few blocks away. Every instinct told me not to go, to stay hidden in the illusion of safety my locked apartment offered. But curiosity and desperation won out. I grabbed a heavy flashlight, the closest thing I had to a weapon, and ventured out. The restroom was poorly lit and smelled of disinfectant mixed with decay. My breath echoed off the tiles, and I crept forward, feeling like prey. There on the sink counter lay my phone face down. Relief battled with unease as I picked it up. The screen was cracked, and the case was smudged, but it was unmistakably mine. And then I saw the note tucked beneath it. You shouldn't have come. My blood ran cold. The air felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. I turned around, every shadow a threat, every noise amplified. The restroom was empty, but the sense of being watched never left. I sprinted home, heart hammering, locking every bolt behind me. I smashed the phone to pieces and reported everything to the police again, though it felt futile. The text stopped, but the fear lingered. Every day, I walked the streets feeling eyes on me, half expecting a message to ping from a phone I no longer own. Whoever had been watching, they knew my life, my habits, my vulnerabilities, and I have no idea if they ever really left. Starting a new job as a pharmacist in a small-town drugstore felt like a fresh beginning. The place had a quiet charm, the kind that settled easily into routine. The store was small, with creaking floors and shelves that held years of dust in their corners. The locals, at first glance, seemed friendly enough, though their eyes lingered a bit too long, curious in a way that felt just shy of invasive. On my first day, as I stocked the shelves and familiarized myself with the layout, I couldn't help but notice the missing posters tacked up on the bulletin board near the entrance. They all bore the same face, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a soft smile. The name underneath read, Dr. Henry Walters, and it didn't take long to realize he had been my predecessor. Curiosity prickled at me, but I knew better than to ask too many questions on my first day. Still, the sight of those posters lingered, gnawing at me throughout my shift. As the day wound down, the usual hustle of closing time turned to an unsettling stillness. The fluorescent lights buzzed a little too loud, and the shadows cast by the rows of medication felt long and strange. I asked a coworker, an older woman with graying hair and a pinched expression, about Dr. Walters. She stiffened, her mouth tightening, "Don't concern yourself," she said, the words clipped and final. She left without another word, and I was left to finish closing the store alone. The air felt heavy, and an inexplicable unease crept under my skin as I locked the doors. The security shutters groaned as they slid down, sealing me inside until morning. I moved to the back to do a final inventory check, trying to shake off the feeling that the walls were pressing closer. And then the lights went out. Pitch black swallowed the store, thick and suffocating. My breath quickened, and I fumbled for my phone. Its screen was dim, the battery nearly dead, but it offered a weak, trembling glow. The creaking started then, soft but deliberate, coming from the aisles behind me. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. Was someone still inside? A customer we'd forgotten to check on? I whispered into the darkness, half hoping for a response, but only silence answered. The store felt like a trap now, its aisles long corridors of unseen threats. My heart thumped painfully in my chest as I stepped forward, the tiny light from my phone barely piercing the darkness. Near the back of the store, a faint scraping sound echoed, metal on metal. I followed it reluctantly, my shoes squeaking against the polished floor. As I rounded the corner, my phone's glow caught something odd. There, under the shelving units, was a small trapdoor. It was partially open, hinges rusted and flaking. This door hadn't been mentioned during training, and it certainly wasn't on the store layout I'd been given. The air around it felt colder, stale, and wrong. My mind screamed to leave it alone, but a grim sense of duty, or perhaps reckless curiosity, pushed me closer. I crouched, hands shaking as I lifted the door slightly. A metallic scent wafted out, and I gagged, my stomach turning. Inside the compartment were old, yellowed medical records and personal items. Keys, glasses, a watch. Things that had once belonged to people. But the most damning discovery was the bundle of clothes. A white lab coat, frayed at the collar, embroidered with a name I'd seen on the bulletin board. Dr. Henry Walters. My head spun. This wasn't just a trapdoor. It was a hidden repository of evidence. Secrets? The realization crashed over me like icy water. Whoever or whatever had orchestrated Dr. Walters' disappearance had left these things behind, buried under layers of false normalcy. My phone flickered, the screen dimming further, and panic seized me. I scrambled back, letting the trapdoor drop shut with a muffled thud. The noise seemed to reverberate through the store, a signal or a warning. Footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the darkness. Not slow and cautious like mine had been, but purposeful, heavy, coming toward me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I bolted, crashing through the aisles, my shoulders slamming into the locked door at the front. I hammered on the glass, screaming, hoping against hope that someone outside might hear. Just as suddenly as they'd gone out, the lights flickered back on. The store was empty, rows of medicine and shelves standing undisturbed. My cries for help felt absurd now, echoing in the too quiet space. My manager arrived moments later, eyes narrowing in irritation. I stammered out what I'd found, but he only stared at me, his face unreadable. "Don't go digging where you shouldn't," he said coldly. And as he turned away, I saw the edge of a yellowed file sticking out of his pocket, the corner marked with a name I'd begun to dread. I was halfway through my deliveries, cruising down familiar streets, when the Detour signs appeared. Bright orange. They pointed toward an unfamiliar, tree-lined road that twisted away from the main highway. My GPS sputtered, struggling to recalculate, and then settled on the new route. Annoyed but without much choice, I followed the signs, the paved road giving way to cracked asphalt and then gravel. The deeper I drove, the more the landscape changed. Dense forest closed in on both sides, swallowing up daylight and leaving only dim slivers that barely lit the way. I cranked up the radio to fight the creeping unease, but the static hissed louder than the music, and the signal cut out completely. The only sound left was the gravel crunching under my tires. The first real warning sign was a rusted car, abandoned at the side of the road. Its windows were shattered, and moss had begun to creep up the wheels. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a breakdown left it there, forgotten. But as I drove further, more abandoned vehicles appeared, scattered haphazardly like relics of some disaster. Doors left wide open, some still with belongings inside, as if people had left in a hurry. A child's stuffed bear lay in the dirt, its eye missing and fur-matted. A chill ran through me, and my grip tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced at the GPS again, but it had frozen, stuck on a blinking searching for route. Panic simmered just under the surface, and I thought about turning back. But the narrow, winding road left no easy option for a U-turn, and the detour signs continued, insistent, leading me further into the woods. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my heart drop. A line of warning signs, each with crude, hand-painted messages. Do not enter. Turn back now. Last chance. The paint had dripped like blood running down the boards. They seemed out of place, a contrast to the official orange detour markers I'd followed. I slowed to a crawl, sweat trickling down my neck despite the cool forest air. Just beyond the signs, the road ended abruptly, a dead end surrounded by trees that loomed like walls. Scattered around the clearing were more abandoned cars, some with their hoods open, others overturned. Shards of glass glittered in the sparse light, and a rusted toolbox lay tipped over, its contents strewn across the ground. The unsettling thing was the silence. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though the forest had swallowed up all sound. Even the breeze that should have rustled the leaves was gone, replaced by a heavy stillness. I sat there, engine idling, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly off. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I instinctively locked the doors. And then I saw them, headlights in the distance, cresting a hill further down the road. Relief flooded me at the thought of another driver, someone who could explain this bizarre detour. But the headlights didn't slow. They grew brighter, barreling toward me, too fast, too direct. I realized with a sick twist of fear that the vehicle was coming right at me, not stopping. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel as I backed up as fast as I could. The approaching car, a black SUV, skidded to a stop where I'd just been, its tires sending up a spray of dirt. The doors flew open, and figures emerged, dressed in dark clothing and wearing featureless masks. They didn't speak, didn't hesitate. They moved with purpose, spreading out to block any path I might take. My body moved on autopilot, adrenaline pumping hard and fast. I slammed the truck into drive, aiming for the narrowest gap between the trees. Branches scraped and tore at the sides of the truck, the road devolving into a maze of roots and overgrowth. In the rearview mirror, the masked figures climbed back into the SUV, headlights swinging around to follow me. My heart was a drum, pounding out a desperate rhythm. The truck fishtailed, barely keeping traction on the rough ground. I didn't dare slow down, even as the forest seemed to close tighter, branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The SUV's headlights loomed behind me, relentless, closing the distance. And then, out of nowhere, I burst onto a familiar road, the same highway I'd been detoured from, bathed in golden late-afternoon light. The SUV was gone. Only the distant hum of passing traffic remained, normal and mundane. I pulled over, gasping for breath, my hands aching from how tightly I'd gripped the wheel. When I called the authorities, they found nothing on that road. No abandoned cars, no detour signs, not even the warning messages. It was as if the entire thing had been a fevered hallucination. But my truck still bore the scratches, the gouges left by branches I couldn't have imagined. And I still couldn't shake the image of those masked figures, waiting in the woods, ready to catch the next driver who followed the wrong signs. It was early morning, and the sky was painted in shades of gray as I laced up my running shoes and headed out for my daily jog. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes you up instantly, and the streets were still quiet, with only a few scattered cars and an occasional dog walker. My route took me past familiar neighborhoods, winding trails, and eventually out toward the less populated outskirts of town. About 3 miles in, I veered onto an old path that led through a stretch of open land. The area had once been destined for development, but the plans had fallen through, leaving behind cracked pavement and a few dilapidated structures. As I ran, I noticed something that hadn't been there before: a lone, weathered phone booth, standing defiantly in the middle of an overgrown clearing. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. The thing was a relic, straight out of a different era, with shattered glass panels and rust creeping up its metal frame. Vines twisted around its base, reclaiming it inch by inch. Just as I was about to jog past, the phone inside started ringing. The sound was jarring, echoing sharply in the emptiness. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated. Who could be calling a phone booth in the middle of nowhere? Logic told me to ignore it, keep moving, but the persistent mechanical ringing drilled into my brain. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. I reached out and picked up the receiver, half expecting the line to be dead. Instead, a voice crackled through the static, low and urgent. "You have to get out of here now," it said. The tone wasn't one of anger or menace, but genuine desperation, as if the speaker was pleading with me. I opened my mouth, about to respond, but the call ended with a sharp click. A shiver coursed down my spine, and I dropped the receiver, my hands slick with sweat despite the cold. The phone went silent, but the eerie sense of being watched wrapped around me like a vice. The clearing was empty, the wind rustling through the tall grass, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I turned to leave, legs heavy with fear, when a sound made me freeze in my tracks. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from somewhere behind me. My breath hitched, and I glanced around, but the clearing remained empty. Panic gripped me as the footsteps grew louder, more distinct, even though I could see no one. The crunch of gravel, the soft swish of displaced grass. Impossible, but real. I forced my legs to move, breaking into a sprint, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The path back seemed longer than before, twisting and unfamiliar, as if the landscape had rearranged itself to trap me. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might or might not see. Finally, I burst onto a more familiar road, my chest heaving. The footsteps had stopped, but my fear clung to me like a second skin. Trying to compose myself, I turned back to look at the clearing, half expecting to see the phone booth gone or the field empty. But it was still there, standing forlornly among the weeds, the receiver hanging limply. Shaken, I finished my run, each step an effort to outpace the lingering dread. Later, I couldn't resist researching the area. I learned that years ago, the land had been the site of a terrible accident. A man had gone missing after taking a late-night phone call from the same booth, his body never found. Locals claimed they still heard footsteps echoing in the dark, or saw glimpses of someone trying to escape the emptiness. I haven't jogged the route since. The memory of that desperate voice, the impossible footsteps, and the inexplicable warning still haunt me. Sometimes I think I hear the echo of a phone ringing in the distance, and I wonder who or what will answer next. It was supposed to be one of those rare, perfect father-son moments. My dad had taken me to a remote lake he used to visit when he was young, far from any towns or cell phone reception. The water was calm, almost mirror-like, and our little rowboat drifted lazily as we cast our lines. It felt timeless, peaceful, until it wasn't. Our first clue that something was wrong came when we found the abandoned rowboat. It was drifting slowly, bumping gently against the reeds on the far side of the lake. At first, Dad thought it was someone's forgotten rental. We paddled over, hoping to return it, but when we got close, the boat's stillness took on a different, heavier meaning. Fishing rods lay across the benches, lines trailing into the water. A cooler sat open, half full of melted ice and sandwiches starting to spoil. The scene was frozen mid-picnic, as if whoever had been there had vanished in an instant. An uneasy silence settled between us. "Must have headed back to shore," Dad said, though his voice was a little too light, too forced. But there were no other cars in the dirt lot where we'd parked, and the forest lining the lake felt suffocatingly still. We tried to shrug it off, rowing back toward our spot, but that sense of being watched started creeping in. The lake had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no rustle of leaves, just the lapping of water against the boat. I glanced nervously at the tree lean, expecting movement, a shadow, something. But the woods held their breath. It was then that our boat jolted, tipping hard to one side. My heart leapt into my throat. Dad and I scrambled to steady ourselves, and when we looked into the water, I half expected to see an alligator or a massive fish. But the surface was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had touched it. We exchanged a look, the kind that said what we were both thinking but didn't want to admit. "Let's pack it in," Dad said, trying to sound casual. We started pulling up our lines, hands shaking, when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The abandoned boat had moved. It was closer to us now, drifting in a slow arc, and its fishing lines were no longer slack. They were taut, pulled hard toward the depths of the lake, as though something below had taken hold. Dad cursed under his breath, fumbling to start rowing us back to shore. My eyes were locked on that other boat, watching as one fishing rod bent dangerously, its reel spinning as if something enormous had hooked it. But nothing surfaced. The tension on the line just held like a grim, unyielding grip from below. We rowed harder, panic driving us as the oars splashed violently in the water. The shore looked so far away, the tree lean a blurred, unreachable promise of safety. Then our boat lurched again, more forcefully this time, and one of the oars slipped from Dad's hands, spinning uselessly in the water. He swore, stretching desperately for it, but it was already drifting away. I leaned over the side, searching the water, expecting something to rise, a shape, a shadow. The lake was a perfect, empty reflection, and yet it felt crowded, like something beneath was waiting, watching. Without an oar, we drifted helplessly, the current pulling us slowly, inevitably, toward the center of the lake, toward that abandoned boat, which now seemed anchored to something unseen. A final, terrifying realization hit. Our boat was being towed, not just drifting. The water around us swirled in subtle eddies, and every fiber of my being screamed that we needed to get out. Dad grabbed my arm, trying to keep calm. "On the count of 3, he whispered, his voice raw. "We swim to shore." He counted, and on 3, we plunged into the water. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath. I kicked frantically, the lake's vast emptiness stretching out below, making me feel small and exposed. I tried not to think about what could be lurking beneath, what unseen thing had claimed the fishing lines and pulled us off course. We reached the shore, gasping, shivering. When we turned back, the rowboat had stopped moving, left bobbing peacefully as if nothing had happened. But the abandoned boat's lines were still taut, still pulled downward, never breaking, never letting go. We drove home in silence, wet and shaking, and Dad never spoke of the trip again. I haven't been near a lake since, but the feeling lingers, the certainty that something is waiting just beneath the surface, patient and hungry. It was a quick stop. I had popped into a small cafe, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that smelled like fresh pastries and strong coffee. The barista had smiled as I paid, and I remembered the clatter of coins, the weight of my wallet slipping back into my pocket, or so I thought. I only realized my mistake hours later, halfway across town. Panicking, I retraced my steps, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Credit cards drained, identity stolen. When I got back to the cafe, it was dim, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the tables. The place had that late-afternoon emptiness, save for a few patrons lingering over their cups. I approached the counter, breathless and anxious, explaining to the barista that I'd left my wallet. He gave me a confused look, then shook his head slowly. "I don't remember you being here today," he said. It was the casual dismissal, like he was trying to brush off a stranger, that set my nerves jangling. I insisted, describing the exact transaction, the coins, the coffee cup I'd held. He only frowned deeper. "Sorry," he muttered, "but I don't recall you coming in." I turned, scanning the room, hoping for some kind of reassurance, a witness who'd seen me. But the few people there paid no attention, wrapped in their own little worlds. Something about their stillness, the way they avoided eye contact, made my skin prickle. I tried not to let paranoia get the better of me, but the unease gnawed at my gut. Defeated, I walked back toward the entrance, wondering if I'd somehow mistaken the place. But then, in a far corner, a shadow shifted. My eyes adjusted, and I noticed something odd. A wallet sitting on a table, half hidden behind a menu. My heart stuttered. It looked exactly like mine. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The wallet was indeed mine, down to the worn leather edges and a sticker I'd placed on the back. But something about it felt wrong, too perfectly placed as though waiting for me. I picked it up, fingers trembling, and glanced around. No one acknowledged me. The barista had turned away, wiping the counter with slow, methodical movements. I hurried out of the cafe, clutching the wallet like a lifeline. Outside, the street was nearly deserted, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. I opened the wallet, half expecting to find everything intact, and to my surprise, my cards and ID were all there. Relief surged through me, until I noticed something that didn't belong. Tucked inside, where I kept receipts, was a note written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "Don't come back. You weren't supposed to remember." My mind reeled. The words seemed to pulse, searing into my brain. Who had put this in my wallet? And what did it mean? You weren't supposed to remember? A chill crept up my spine, cold and insidious. The world around me felt off kilter, as though something had shifted and I hadn't noticed until now. I scanned the street, searching for anyone who might have been watching, but the few people there moved with strange, detached purpose, their faces blank, eyes averted. It was as if the entire block shared some silent, unspoken understanding, one that excluded me. Fear gnawed at me, primal and urgent. I didn't stick around to question it. I started walking fast, then faster, putting as much distance as I could between me and that cafe. The note felt heavier in my pocket, a tangible reminder that something had slipped through the cracks of reality, something that wasn't meant for me. When I got home, I locked the door and tried to calm down, convincing myself it was some elaborate prank, a misunderstanding. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed against a secret I wasn't meant to know, a hidden seam in the fabric of normalcy. And the warning? It felt like a promise that whatever watched over that place would remember me, even if I tried to forget. Friends, please support my channel by subscribing and liking it. You are the best.